monthly broadcast in which we interview people about their spiritual lives and how they support and encourage others in lifting their spirits. I am Reverend Grossman, Interfaith Minister, Director of Spiritual Services for Constellation Hospice, offices in Newburyport, and also offer spiritual coaching virtually on a donation basis.
And I'm Ted Jones, a meditation instructor at North Shore Insight Meditation Center. I'm also a workshop leader exploring the intersection of Buddhist and Christian meditation practices. Our show is based on 4 principles. First, that everyone is spiritual. Sometimes we are conscious and active regarding our spirituality, sometimes not. But even when not, we still have a spirit.
Second, there are many ways to lift your spirit, including not only through religious practice, but also through nature, art, human relationship, and service to others, to name a few.
Third, each person's spiritual path is unique and may change in large or small ways over time.
And fourth, it is important to respect your spiritual journey, trusting that one step leads to another, and to respect other people's unique spiritual journeys, regardless of how different it may be from your own. We are not here to convince you of the benefits of any particular path. Rather, we're just offering food for thought.
Our guest today is Reverend Dr. Stephen Notis. He's a retired United Methodist minister, having served in congregations in New England for 37 years. He's a practitioner and teacher of contemplative practices, an avid cyclist, and a new grandfather.
Congratulations on that.
Thank you very much.
In my tradition, mazel tov.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
It's been wonderful.
So, Steve, if you'd be willing to share with us and our audience your spiritual journey, starting all the way back and
Sure.
coming up to today.
Sure. Well, I was raised in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. All 4 of my grandparents came from Europe, and if you had asked me when I was a child if that was significant, I'm not sure I would have thought it was. It was just how my family was. We went to church on Sunday. I was an altar boy. We were fairly close with the Greek Orthodox priest. He had a place on a pond that was right next to ours. My dad was a developer, and he sold them a lot next to ours. So the priest and his family and 2 children were there, and he was someone who was an important person in my life. One of those people, like a teacher or a coach, that was important in my growing up to help form me. But I don't know really if I really thought a lot about it. It wasn't until I was older in college that spirituality became alive again for me. I decided while I was a student to become a philosophy major. My father was very disappointed in that because he wanted to raise someone who had a good job, is what he thought. So when I said I wanted to be a philosophy major, he was pretty doubtful about that. But it all ended up working out pretty well. At the time, what was going on was there was a Protestant chaplain at the university. He was Lutheran, and he was a big influence in my journey. And I really didn't know a lot about what to do or where to go. I had another professor who was the professor. He taught Bible literature at the university, and he was a great guy. His name was Ralph Yelm, and he said to me that I should think about perhaps going to theology school. I'd thought about that, but when you hear someone that you respect saying that to you, how much more important that is to you, particularly as a young man. And that began kind of planting the seed. And so I enrolled at Boston University School of Theology. And the first year at that 3-year program was really helping me to put words on what I felt. Spirituality can be fairly amorphous. And that's the great thing about spiritual traditions, is they kind of give it some kind of housing and some kind of container to help me understand it. And that's really what it did to me. It gave me words to understand what had happened to me, what this sort of opening to something that I really had not imagined being present in my life was. If you had asked me when I was in high school what I would have told you I was a Marxist. I was pretty left, politically leaning. I still am fairly left anyway, but that's another conversation. But so it really helped me to understand a dimension of my life that really hadn't occurred to me, and it wasn't all that important in my earlier life. And so while I was at Boston University, the first year, as I said, was really a time when it kind of gave me a sense of putting words on what I sensed or what I felt in my life. I considered myself to be kind of generic Protestant, mostly because that's what I knew. I mean, if I'd been in some other situation, it could have been something very different, I think, in some ways. But that's what I was exposed to, and the people I knew were of that tradition. Even though I was raised Greek Orthodox, that wasn't, for me, a living tradition, because it was so much around the Greek language and the Greek culture, which for my grandparents was very important. And there's definitely some sympathies that I have and some sensibilities I have that are informed by that very important tradition. But the Greek culture is not something that I have continued to invest myself in. My mother always wanted me to marry a Greek girl. That did not happen, right? I was really in a kind of a generic Protestant kind of mode, so what happened is I started my second year in theological school, and one of the things that you were given to do in that second year, it was a 3-year master's degree, was to work at an internship, and it just so happened that I went to a United Methodist church in Davis Square in Somerville, which at the time was kind of a seedy area of Somerville, but now I guess it's the place to be, right? Yeah, exactly. It's kind of funny how things changed so much in all those years. But, the guy that was the pastor in that church was also, interestingly enough, raised in the Eastern Orthodox tradition too. His name was George Abbo Samra. He was Syrian, and he was just a fascinating man who, again, was very affirming and was very supportive of me and gave me things to do and gave me jobs in the community. And I began doing some of the work of being a pastor. And I think that's kind of, people sometimes say that they felt a call to be a pastor or to be a rabbi. And, I don't discount that. But for me, it was really a gradual process. It was the kind of thing that I felt something, and then people around me would affirm that, would suggest things, would say, I see that in you, maybe you should try this. And I would go along with it and find myself, feeling good about that particular work. And I ended up working in that church for 2 years, which was a wonderful formative process. We did some really great work there. One of the things that we did, it was a big, huge building with a gymnasium and a bowling alley, and we had a lot of space. And one of the things we did, we started a homeless shelter, which, this would have been back in like 1984. That was fairly... that was not something that was happening a lot back then so much, and I remember that being a significant
One of the
work.
things that I'm getting from what you're saying, when you talked about that second-year internship and starting to do the work of a pastor,
Yes.
it's like that the work of a pastor is so much larger than what happens on Sunday in front of the congregation. And I guess that just struck me,
Yeah.
and maybe we want to elaborate on
Well,
that a little
it's
bit.
funny you say that because I remember one of my uncles said to me, "Great job, you get to work one day a week. How'd you swing that?" And I think people think that, right, of pastors, or rabbis for Saturday maybe, but it's much more than that, obviously. In a lot of ways, being a pastor, it's like you're really almost like in a secular term, you're almost like a program director. There's a lot of things going on in most parishes, and particularly thriving churches that want to do stuff, right? And there's a lot of programming that goes on, and so it can be as busy as you want it to be. And I remember for me, one of the things early on that I really made a deep commitment to, and this is perhaps more to the question that you're addressing with what is it that feeds your spirit. It was around cultivating my own spiritual life and how important that was to me, because you could burn out very easily. You could do all day long, and find yourself really at a deficit on that balance. And so fairly early on, I realized that for me, spiritual formation would be a very important part of my journey. And that's actually what I ended up focusing on, particularly toward the end of my career, the last maybe 20 years or so. I ended up doing a lot around spiritual formation. So, the first church I went to was a small country church up in near Waterville, Maine, in the town of Clinton. I was there 6 years, and it was a wonderful place to be. It wasn't a place I'd want to have stayed for a long, long time, just because I really wasn't the culture I wanted to be part of, and I wanted good schools for my children, so on and so forth. And we ended up going to the Portland area in Maine, where I grew up, which was great. That was a wonderful experience. I was there for a number of years, and then I served in Reading, Massachusetts, and then most recently I served 12 years in Hampton, New Hampshire. And in the last few years, probably about 11 years or so, I took a day-long retreat, or not a day-long. I think it might have been a day-long retreat. It was the first one I did at the Insight Meditation Center in Newburyport, and then I did the introduction to meditation that Ted Jones offered, and that kind of was my entry into the Buddhist meditation tradition. Although I'd been, familiar with a lot of contemplative Christian spirituality, I think that helped me deepen it and appreciate it in many, many ways. And that kind of cross-fertilization has been, for me, very, very important and very vital in ways that I would not have imagined prior to doing it. I actually remember even, people doing that kind of thing and thinking, well, what's wrong with their own tradition that they're a part of now? And, but it's nothing wrong with it. But I think for me, it was a matter of coming at it from another way. So now I consider myself really a kind of someone who has kind of like dual belonging. I very much am a Christian. One of the things that's just happened recently is I retired in July, and I didn't go to church for about 6 months. And then just the last few weeks, I started doing it, and it felt good. It felt like kind of coming home to something I'd forgotten about a little bit. And it's interesting because it wasn't like it was an intentional thing either. So all of a sudden I felt like, I think, well, today I'm going to do that. And I went to a local church here in Newburyport, and it was a good experience. So for me, it's always been important to just be sensitive to my journey and to not be afraid to try something and to see where it leads, because all these things are, often labeled as paths, and to walk them is, I think, key for me, and that's been a big part of my own journey is walking them. I was doing practices that deepen that awareness, that faith.
Being able to maintain a strong commitment to your own spiritual journey, spiritual growth, which you talked about identifying really early, like I don't want to, burn out here with all the stuff that I could be involved in with a pastor. My sense is that was probably a really important decision in terms not just for yourself, but also how you could be responsive and nurturing to the spiritual paths of the people that you were serving.
Absolutely. I think in many ways, you can't share what you don't have. And so you need to have a grounding yourself. And I think, I think of it as balance. I think, different people need, I think depending on personality, different things. I remember, there was a woman in one of my parishes who, in my first church, we started a food pantry there. And she had been in the choir. She'd done many things that were like in the church, but giving food out to these people in the community who needed food, she said to me that was one of the most spiritual things I ever got involved in, right? And one might not think of that as spirituality, right? Because you think of spirituality as something that's often done, in terms of prayer practices or things involved in worship. But service, if that's what's maybe missing in your life or not there, can help deepen you. Oftentimes clergy, because they're so involved in serving others and trying to meet others' needs, really, really need to work on taking care of themselves. It's an important part of it. And I think it really adds a depth to your ministry to do that. Without that, I could not, and I think in many ways you share what you know. And I think the most authentic preaching and teaching and counseling I ever gave anybody came out of my own experience, my own journey. Because I knew that it was real for me. It wasn't something I'd read in a book. It was something I'd experienced.
You mentioned the term spiritual formation.
Yes.
Could you say more about that? And I don't know if this would fit into talking about spiritual formation, but if in any way it does, other than religious practice or involvement.
Yeah. Like I mentioned before, I think balance is key. I think it's important to have a lot of aspects of your life intact to be a whole person. So I think that nurturing spirituality and for allowing that to be something you form can take on a bunch of different forms. I know for me, I'm an avid cyclist. I ride my bike in the wintertime, right? And so I have a bunch of different bikes with some with studded tires, and I'll be out. And for me, to be out in the woods is vital. It's so important for me to be out in nature, to go for walks with my dog and my friends and my wife. All those things are very important parts of it. And I think that, and I think that's not uncommon. I think if you talk to a lot of people, they have a sense of something sacred in nature and in the world around them. We're often too busy to sort of nurture that. And I think, if we're too busy to do that, maybe we're missing something in life. I think a lot of people, unfortunately, deprive themselves of the richness of life that's there for the taking. They think maybe they feel guilty about doing it, but I always liked it that Jesus said, that the first commandment is to love God, to be connected to something bigger than oneself, a sense of spirituality. And then the second commandment is out of that is to love others, right? And that's kind of what I'm saying here. So I think, both of those things are vitally connected, and I think they feed on each other. I think if you had too much of one, right, you would show itself up almost like in a diet, right? If you eat too much of one kind of food, there'd be something missing in another area in your life. So spiritual formation is really a word that I think is important, a phrase that's important, because it helps us to be able to be intentional about nurturing our spirit. And I know for me, I wasn't raised to do that. And most people in our culture are not raised to do that. We value other things much more important, things like making a living, right? When I mentioned before that my father was upset with me when I decided to be a philosophy major and study religion, he was concerned that I would make a living. He loved me and he was concerned about my well-being. It wasn't a problem for him that way, but he didn't have a sense of that's something else in his life, and I think some of it was just how different people are different too. Maybe other people have other things that, nurtured them. But for me, I needed things that were more intentional and more spiritual in my own life, yeah.
And that I've heard often from artists, whether they be musicians or dancers or actors.
Absolutely.
That's nice. Do it in the community, but get a job.
Yeah. Oh, it's very common. And that's what my father said to me. He said, "You'll be a well-educated cab driver, my son." He cared about me. His parents are immigrants, and he was the first in his family to go to college, and and all that, right? And they valued education, and he wanted me to be like a lawyer or a doctor or something along those lines was the idea, right? So, but it wasn't in the cards. But he eventually came around. He became it. When he saw me doing what I was doing, he was very proud of that.
Good.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things that interests me is that you've spent 37 years as a pastor, and that the kind of landscape of mainstream religion in this society has really changed over that period of time. And so I'm interested in kind of your thoughts about what you've observed there, particularly from the standpoint of spirituality and of people who are either spiritual teachers or pastors or whatever, and how that affects the ability to nurture people along a spiritual journey.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things there that I think go together. People don't often think of churches as places to nurture their spiritual journey, which is sort of ironic. And I think it's a little bit unfortunate that I think lots of times we've made faith communities, places where they have potluck suppers and people get together and do crafts, right? And all those things are nice community connections. It's nice to be in groups with other people. But oftentimes the church hasn't done the best job of helping adult seekers, people who are really looking for more in their life and have a sense that there is more. And those people oftentimes, look in other directions for that kind of thing. When I first was ordained, that wasn't so true. People came to church. I remember my first two churches grew without me necessarily even thinking about, church growth. I mean, that's sort of there's like a whole library of church growth books out there to help you grow your church. Because, they aren't these days. I mean, people aren't involved in spiritual community. The fastest growing group right now in the country are nuns, and that's not religious sisters. That's people with no religious connection at all, right? But many of those people would consider themselves spiritual. I think the rub is that churches aren't always seen as places where they can get that spirituality nurtured. They might go to a yoga center, they might go to a meditation center, and it's not always the case. But but my experience is that most churches have small groups in them that do help people nurture their spirituality. And for me, what I loved about my work, there are many things about my work that I enjoyed over the years, but where my passion was with those small groups. And typically in any congregation, there's maybe like 20% of the community that's a part of that kind of thing that really wants more. And if you do a group on, how to understand the Gospel of Mark more spiritually, or how to pray, or how to meditate, right? Things like that. They'll come out for that kind of thing. But by and large, oftentimes people in the pews are more comfortable with a sense of belonging, a sense of community, which is all very important, in a sense of being a part of a friend circle in that community, which is great. But there's a whole other piece too. When I mentioned before, it's the love of God, and then out of that flows love of others, right?
Yes,
so
absolutely.
Yeah. So, the landscape has changed. And I think what that's done for many Protestant churches, at any rate, I can speak for that, it's made them oftentimes anxious organizations, because they can't take for granted that they're going to be able to pay their bills, that they're going to be able to hire a pastor, that they're going to be able to do the programs and maintain the services that they did have for generations. And many of them can't anymore. So it creates a spiral. It's often very, very difficult. My first few churches, like I said, that wasn't the case. And I remember, when things came up, conflicts in the community, what would often happen is people would say, hey, well, we're good, we're doing okay. The church is growing, no big deal, right? It's all gonna, it's all right. We can kind of deal with this. But when that's not happening, when you're worried about your own survival, then oftentimes those conflicts become much more sticky and more difficult for the congregation to let go of and move on from. And those kinds of conflicts will always happen in any group of people. It doesn't matter who they are. It's just human beings together in one place. So,
And along the same lines as the nuns, I'm sure we have a lot of viewers and listeners who would be identifying themselves.
Yeah.
So how might they lift their spirit? You mentioned yoga, meditation, other thoughts about people who aren't going to join a religious practice?
Yeah, I would say, many people, reading is helpful that way. Spiritual books can be helpful. I know, for me, this may not be for others, but for me, one of the things that I loved, like I said, I hadn't gone to a parish for about 6 months once I retired. I wanted to kind of give it a break a little bit and kind of come back to it. Singing again in a community was just great.
Yeah.
That really, that's like that is a physical experience. And it's wonderful. So, people, but again, I think there was a time when people got together, right? And they would sing around the piano in a family. Sure. So I think a lot of these things, probably need to be nurtured and brought back. I know a lot of people, particularly these days with, being on all the time with devices, find a way to create and carve out some kind of Sabbath time, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a particular day of the week. It can even be like a part of a day where you just sort of put those things down and you intentionally do something that nurtures you. And it could be going for a walk with your dog. It could be, one of the great things about living here on the seacoast of Massachusetts is that we have all these great places to do that with. So I would say, find things that touch your spirit. Going to an art museum might be one of those things, going to the symphony, going to any kind of live music, or listening to even the recordings, that's great too. But just to realize that dimension of you. The difficulty, I think, the people who say, well, I'm spiritual but not religious, is they forget that good religion, right? Good religion provides structures that nurture spirituality, right? And oftentimes people that say, well, I'm spiritual but not religious, don't do a lot to be spiritual. They don't do those religious practices to nurture that. Yeah. And so they often feel like, you say, I'm spiritual, I really am. But if you ask them, well, what do you do with that? They wouldn't have a lot to say. They may, but oftentimes that can be the case. So I would say, all of these things are practices. This is one of the things that the Buddhist tradition has given me a real awareness of, is, it is a practice. And you do it again and again. And it sometimes, you show up for it, and it doesn't necessarily show up for you, but you just keep on showing up for it again and again. It's the same way that you go to the gym, right? You can't just go to the gym once a year and think you're going to do anything, right? Yeah. You got to show up, and you got to do it. And it is that kind of persistence. And I think that's a big part of the spiritual journey. People say, I brush my teeth religiously, right? What that means is they do it, whether they feel like it or not. It's like, well, today I don't feel like brushing my teeth, so I think I'm going to give it a break for a while. Yeah. No, you do it because you realize that matters. And I think it's the same thing with our spiritual journeys. And people that are spiritual but not religious. Even people who are religious sometimes don't do that things to nurture their spirits. Like I was saying, sometimes religion can be very focused around belonging and community and not nurture other parts of people's spirits. Yeah.
We're doing the prayers, the rituals without thinking about them.
Exactly. I mean, bringing heart to it is really the thing. I mean, to say, okay, right now, I'm going to be fully present. I'm going to allow this to touch me. I'm going to be vulnerable to it, and I'm going to let it speak. And you never know how it works that way. I mean, there are times when, I'll be singing some line of a hymn that I don't actually believe what I'm singing necessarily, right? It's some theology, but it'll touch me in a funny way that feels like something in me says yes to that in some way that I don't even understand, I think. Yeah. So,
Yeah, you're really touching on something that's so important, that sense of wholehearted commitment to the present moment, which is something that in insight meditation that you practice, I teach a little bit of it. And it seems like, I always tell people, students of mine, that anything that we're doing becomes meditation when we give it a wholehearted commitment to be present.
absolutely. Yeah. I always loved Brother Lawrence was one of the great one of the great classic Christian spiritual teachers, and for many years, his job in the monastery was to be the person who ran the kitchen, and he used to say that washing is worship. And I think if we bring that attitude toward it, if we're mindful of what we're doing, it becomes important work. And I think it's about it's about being present to what it is you're doing. And
Was
not
there a
just going through the
receptive
motions.
audience to that in the your pastoral
Yeah,
experience? Or again, kind of mixed?
Yeah, it's mixed. I mean, there are people, my sense is that in every community, there are people who want to go deep. And those are the people that I felt the work I did with them was the work that really touched my heart, was really important to me, was an expression of what I cared about. And many things are important to a lot of people. But, in every community, there's a group of people that are kind of geared that way. And you never know what'll happen, too. It's fascinating. Being a pastor, you'll see somebody has some kind of an event in their life, and all of a sudden, the things they've sung or the prayers they've prayed all of a sudden have meaning in a way they didn't before, because life has changed for them. Maybe they've lost someone. Maybe there's been a birth of a child in the family. Maybe they've gone through some kind of a health crisis that makes them, really appreciate a simple thing like, the goodness of simply being here, right? Something so basic. So you don't ever know. I remember I always like to joke that people would come out of church and say, "Thank you for saying thus and such a thing." And I think to myself, I'm not sure I said that, but if you got that out of what I said, then God bless you, right? And that's great. I think that and again, what spirituality is, we're channels of something larger than ourselves, the spirit bigger than us, right? And different people will see different lights in that, or different shades, different things, and and it's not us, right? It's something bigger, and we're channels of that, we're vehicles for that to happen, but it's much bigger than us. And so in every parish there are people who were intentional about their spirituality, or were serious adult learners and really wanted to understand their faith or really go deeper, but many weren't. They provided other important functions in the community. They did things that were great. Maybe they were on the finance committee and they made sure the budget was balanced, or they were on the trustees and they made sure the building was warm, right? That matters too. It's not like it doesn't matter, right? But it's nice, I think, if a spiritual community is a spiritual community first, right? And that was always my ideal that I tried to kind of nurture and live up to, both by what I did in my own example as well, hopefully.
And as has been mentioned, service and connection are two strong things that lift our spirit.
Absolutely.
So they were getting that piece of it.
Absolutely, they were. And to them, that was very meaningful. And I think it's for everyone. Like I said, that woman who was in the choir and did many church kind of things, serving in the food pantry, said to me, that was so spiritual. Yeah, because it's like, but it's another piece that was sort of maybe missing for her journey. So, again, something else I might say to the nuns out there is, try something, see what it's like, try it on. See how it feels. And oftentimes it may feel weird. I mean, I didn't grow. One of the weird things about the Orthodox tradition I was raised in is that the community doesn't sing. There's a choir, and then there's a cantor and the priest, and they all sing, and you kind of sit there, right? And when I first became Protestant, I didn't sing. And I felt uncomfortable with it. As a matter of fact, I remember when this is a funny experience I had when I was in theology school. We were singing some Christmas carols, and we were recording it, and the tape recorder was in my lap, so my voice was louder than anybody else, and it was like way off key. It was terrible. And I remember thinking, oh God, I can't do it. I'm so bad at that. But now I love it, and in parishes, and eventually it became real for me, and I got good at it, and I would even lead singing in the community, and simple things, responses. Yeah, I wouldn't get up and sing a solo, but little pieces of the liturgy I would sing and be able to do that, and I would never have done that early on. So sometimes again, it's that piece of persistence. It's like we understand that if you want to run a marathon, that you can't just get off the couch and do that. You need to do the little things that lead to that. It's the same thing for our spiritual journey as well.
You reminded me in sharing that an early experience I had in seminary, being Jewish, prayer is liturgical.
Yeah.
And there's thousands of them for every type of situation.
Yeah.
So after the first week of working together, I'm on the phone with my mentor, and she says, well, to start, let's pray. So you lead, you say a prayer. And I go, which prayer? I had no experience of impromptu prayer.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. No.
So I had to.
You had to learn that. No, it's like that. No, and it takes a while, and it's not something. And if it's like the first time you rode a bike, right? It's gonna be uncomfortable, and you're gonna fall down. But that's what's nice, I think, about understanding. One of the things that they say, sometimes in the Buddhist tradition is, practice, not perfection. And I think that's an important thing in all spiritual paths, is to understand, we have these ideas of how it should be, but, hopefully we can let go of those things a little bit to accept things how they are, which is quite different usually.
You talked about being Jewish in the seminary. That another thing we were talking about music and singing, and that you have your own history there with Rock My Soul, which I don't think you're aware of, but would you characterize that as a gospel group?
There's a gospel choir, black gospel.
Yeah, that's great. Wow.
Yeah, with all white singers. we were all faking it.
That's great, though.
Yeah, so 7 years I was in that gospel choir.
That's great.
So when Steve is talking about things touching in an unexpected way, I mean, you're singing about Jesus, but it's you're
lifting the spirit.
Lifting the spirit.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, gospel music, I mean, I think, and this touches on something really vital, I think good spirituality transcends traditions, I think. It's bigger than that. You look at someone like Dr. King, right? Martin Luther King, who we just celebrated his day a few weeks ago. He is someone who people oftentimes forget he was a Baptist minister. But that was the ground he came out of. But he was so important. He was so significant that he transcended that. And people sing Amazing Grace, right? People know that song because it transcends the tradition. And I think, that's a testament to how good spirituality connects and unites. And I think we need that so much in our world these days. There's so much, polarizing and focusing on differences that we forget that we have things in common. We're not all the same, but we have things in common, and that's great.
Very. Love thy neighbor as thyself. It's in all traditions.
Absolutely. Now, Jesus got that from Leviticus. So. Absolutely.
And it's important, I always think, to make note that it's not more than thyself.
Right.
That it's as thyself, and that there has to be a compassion that's going inward too, rather than, because sometimes that can get kind of distorted into a sort of codependency of I just have to be giving, and lose touch with what you need.
Yeah. Most people don't think about the second part of the phrase.
Yeah.
And I think it's the capacity to love ourselves, to be at peace with ourselves, and we can give that to others.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, it's vital, I think, and you're right. People forget that that's, again, a balance.
Yeah.
It really is.
Well, Steve, it's been wonderful to have you here. I really
You're welcome.
appreciate what you've shared with us. And
You're welcome.
in finishing up, is there anything you'd like to add? Or
Just that I appreciate also being asked these questions. I love talking about this. Having retired in July, I miss talking about this kind of thing, and it's nice to have people to ask me these kinds of questions and to share what really means a lot to me. It's been nice in retirement being someone who is, gone back to the role of being in the pew, being the learner again, which is great. I mean, that's kind of how it all began with me, and I'm happy to do that. But it's nice to have a place where I was asked a bit about my own journey and had a chance to share that. So,
Well, thanks very much for being here.
you're welcome.
Yeah, so thank you for watching and listening, and hope in some way something that we've shared has lifted your spirit, and may that be so for the coming month. Amen.